You are watching Law and Crime's live coverage of U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee confirmation hearings for President Trump's Supreme Court pick, Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He's currently a judge on the D.C. Circuit. He is the second nomination President Trump has made to a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. We just listened to questions from Senator Amy Klobuchar of Minnesota. She was asking Judge Kavanaugh about the First Amendment. That moved on to Senator Ben Sasse from Nebraska. He's a Republican. He's making analogies between Judge Kavanaugh's basketball life and his judicial life. Here to talk about some of what we're listening to is Latonia Hines. She's a prosecutor from the Atlanta, Georgia area. Latonia, good to see you again here on the Law and Crime Network.
Good to see you as well. And I'm a part-time professor at Kennesaw State University, too. So I think what's very interesting, especially when you have Senator Sachs come on there, and he's talking about precedents and the idea that you're not going to make up rules along the way. Is that what you're going to do, Judge Kavanaugh, when you get on the bench? Are you going to adhere to the things that are already there? And that's what precedent is. That means that something's already been established. Are you going to be one of those people who's now trying to make different and new rules? And that's interesting. And the reason why that's interesting is for cases like Roe versus Wade. There's a precedent that's there, and it's been eroded a bit over the years. And there is a view, especially a partisan view, that that needs to be overruled. So are you going to go with the rule of law as it currently is, or are you going to come in here with a particular type of objective? And that's kind of an interesting thing to look at. What I did think that was interesting, too, is that Senator Sachs tried to outline, and he seems very fair in his thought process of asking questions. He went through this whole process of asking, what are your rules of being an umpire? The point is that you're supposed to be impartial, that you are able to observe what's going on and be able to make a determination or ruling without any bias to sides. And I thought that was very interesting.
I think the analogy is interesting. Look, I mean, Senator Sasse at times has been critical of President Trump. He is a Republican, so he has a reputation for being a little bit more independent. So his line of questioning here is a little bit more biting, even though it's under the surface from what we've seen from a number of the other Republicans who sit on that committee.
Yes, definitely so. Especially because when he went in, it was interesting. He went through the different rules that he had in his book, but he went back to that main one about the rules and the rules being made up. And he said, you know what? It's a little bit different. I understand what it's like to coach, and I understand umpiring and about football, but it's different when you're on the court. And he wants to make sure that Judge Kavanaugh, if he's put on this bench, he plays by the rules that are supposed to be
He'll play by the rules.
governing.
Yeah, we need to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network. We will be right back with more live coverage of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearing. Continuing our live coverage of the Senate Judiciary Committee's hearings, confirmation hearings for Supreme Court pick Brett Kavanaugh. Prosecutor and Professor Latonia Hines is still with us here on the Law and Crime Network to help break down some of what's happening in these hearings. We're listening to Senator Sasse from Nebraska ask questions of the candidate as we speak. But Latonia, I wanted to ask you about some of these emails that came out earlier today that originally were marked committee confidential. Senator Booker said, hey, look, I'll just release them and I will suffer what consequences come as they may. One of the emails a lot of people seized on was an email from Brett Kavanaugh to others discussing drafts of possible op-ed pieces. And in it, he said, I'm not sure that all legal scholars refer to Roe versus Wade as the settled law of the land, since a court can always overrule its precedent, and 3 justices on the court would apparently do so right now. That a lot of people are pointing to as a smoking gun, but a lot of other people are saying, hey, look, he's just pointing out the status of a constitutional debate. Where do you sit on this?
Well, I mean, and just looking at it, it is disturbing, obviously, but you never know how someone's thought process is going to be. And that's why it's a little bit creepy when you hear this the way it is. If you are a Democrat and you are a liberal and you're concerned about Roe versus Wade, you're very concerned and very alarmed by hearing this, because it seems, contrary to what Senator Sachs said, it seems like that Kavanaugh would not consider Roe versus Wade to be a precedent type of case, a case that you would follow, and that he would be of the opinion that it could be something that could be overruled, or the principles are not so set in foundation. What I do think has been interesting that has happened so far, especially with Senator Sachs and his examination of Kavanaugh, is that we've had this civics lesson. We don't have civics much anymore. And so for those young people out there who are of voting age and even younger, they're getting a chance to learn about constitutional law, understand why is this important. As a law professor, as an attorney, we've all studied constitutional law. And so some of these cases that he's mentioning, they are something we know without a doubt. These are foundational cases. When you talk about Brown versus the Board of Education, when you talk about Erie versus Pennsylvania, those are really important cases. And for legal scholars, anytime there's this idea that maybe you wouldn't consider that case to be a precedent, something to be followed that was ruled on by the Supreme Court, there's concern that you may not view these as solid principles and be willing to go against it.
Excuse me, I understand the concern. Yes, we're going to continue our coverage of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearing when we return here on Law and Crime. Questioning there about the role of special prosecutors, about Watergate, about investigating the president from Senator Chris Coons, a Democrat of Delaware. He's asking the questions of President Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominee, Brett Kavanaugh. Latonia Hines is an attorney, prosecutor, law professor, et cetera, in the Atlanta, Georgia area. She's joining us. Latonia, what do you make of this line of questioning? I mean, this kind of cuts to the core of one of the issues a lot of people are debating right now, given the investigation by special counsel Mueller into whether or not there was Russian interference in the 2016 election.
Yes, very much so. And not only that, with that op-ed memo that came out yesterday, the idea that this president could possibly be embroiled in some type of criminal charges is becoming something that could be a reality, other than just conjecture. And so it's really important to be able to know whether or not if something has to go to the Supreme Court, which would be one of those reviewing agencies, obviously because of the separations of powers and dealing with issues with the executive branch, whether or not if Kavanaugh sits on that, if he sits on the bench, how is he going to decide? And it's really important because we've all have heard over the last few months that President Trump is not happy with Robert Mueller. He's not happy that Jeff Sessions had this independent counsel. And he has toyed with, or at least he has toyed with in social media, the idea of what if Mueller wasn't there? So the question becomes, and everybody's already said it, it's almost like that would be the nuclear button. If he fired Robert Mueller, at this point in time, the government would start going into some chaos because something might need to be done, kind of like what happened with Nixon. And so this is the reason for this line of questioning. The question is, do you think that the president has the right to unilaterally to do this or not? And where he comes down on this is really important to the Democrats, especially with the way that things have been going with this Russia investigation and how things have been going in the last few days.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that we all started researching when this started coming out from the president, that maybe this was a possible option, or at least it was being attributed to him that it was a possible option. So I started researching it. And of course, then, Latonia, you know as well as I do that you get into all these debates about inferior constitutional officers and who has firing power and who doesn't, and just how far down the president can go in singling out a lower level person. In other words, not a direct agency head or someone who has to be directly confirmed by the Senate or whatnot. You know, how far down the chain can the president make a cut, basically? And that is the issue that's basically up for debate here. We will continue talking about this issue and continue our live coverage of the confirmation hearing for Judge Kavanaugh when we return here on Law and Crime. You heard it there, Chairman Chuck Grassley saying they're going to take a 15-minute recess in the confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh. He is President Donald Trump's pick for a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. Latonia Hines is an attorney, law professor, prosecutor in the Atlanta, Georgia area. She's with me today here on Law and Crime to break this down. We saw some pretty tough back and forth back there from Chris Coons, a Democrat of Delaware, and the candidate on the subject of presidential power and the limits there, too. But I think the tail end of the conversation, there was some civility in there, which it seemed to me that Judge Kavanaugh appreciated. These two know one another. They went to law school with one another, and it goes back a long time. But that doesn't get in the way of their professional roles, one wanting to represent constituents, the other trying to put the best face forward for being a federal judge.
Most definitely. As a matter of fact, this is almost kind of like what we would do in law school, like moot court. You're having to go through getting questions asked of you, rapid fire. You need to be able to know about the law. It's like when you go do an oral argument of some sort and you're trying to do your own position, and you've got these judges here, which I'm sure that Judge Kavanaugh has already dealt with himself as a judge, that you have all these people asking you these questions, and you've got to be able to answer them very quickly. And these may be the same people that you see and have lunch with, that you may even, play sports with or whatever. And so you know each other, but you're in an adversarial situation for this purpose. And this purpose, it's meant to be a bit, I don't want to say contentious, but it is meant to be challenging. And that's what we're seeing.
We certainly are. Look, I mean, this is par for the course for the professional buzzword, which is professionalism, and that is having a civil yet sometimes difficult debate over difficult issues and still be civil in the process. We're going to take a bit of a time out here for ourselves on Law and Crime. We're going to dial back to some previous back and forth here. We're going to listen, I believe, to Sheldon Whitehouse, Senator from Rhode Island, asking about the Federalist Society, constitutional questions related thereto, and some discussions that Judge Kavanaugh has had in the past at Federalist Society events. Back, everybody. This is Law and Crime, and we are in the midst of live coverage of the Senate Judiciary Committee's hearings on President Donald Trump's pick for a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court, Judge Brett Kavanaugh. Those hearings are in the midst right now of a 15-minute break. So we're going to continue to break down the questioning as it has happened thus far and look a little bit ahead. Latonia Hines is a prosecutor and law professor in the Atlanta, Georgia area. She's joining us here on Law and Crime. Latonia, I wanted to ask you about this. We're expecting when we come back from the break to hear questions from Jeff Flake. He's a Republican from Arizona, but he is another Republican who has butted heads from time to time, and perhaps time and time again, with President Trump. So just to sort of recap a little bit of the back and forth here, you had Senator Flake referring to President Trump saying, quote, "We may have hit bottom," referring to the Trump presidency. Referring to Republicans, Jeff Flake, who is a Republican, has said they, quote, "might not deserve to lead." Of course, this resulted in President Trump saying of him, quote, "let's face it, he is a flake," referring to his last name. That's the insult that came from the president. CNN has said that Jeff Flake is, quote, Trump's possible worst nightmare. So what kind of questioning can we expect from Senator Flake when we come back from this break of President Trump's pick for a seat on the highest court in the land?
I think we're going to have more questions about the independent counsel issue, whether or not a sitting president has the ability to fire at will the independent counsel, and then also whether or not the sitting president should be subjected to, if there is a true criminal investigation and charges that come down, should he be subjected to criminal charges, even though he is the president. And the one thing I will say about Jeff Flake, if you, as people are aware, he is a Republican. He's been very vocal about his displeasure with President Trump and his policies. And at the same time, he has a bit of freedom because he's also announced, and we are aware that he's not going to continue his Senate career. He now has a bit of freedom. But at the same time, he is still a Republican. He still states that he espouses everything of his party, and he doesn't believe that Donald Trump really does that. So it's going to be very interesting to see him ask these questions of Kavanaugh, and specifically questions that deal with how would you deal with the president if the president were facing charges, and this independent counsel, things that really touch on what's been going on currently that we've seen here in the media.
Look, I'll second that. Jeff Flake, a Republican who has been at odds with President Trump. I can't wait for his questioning of President Trump's pick for the U.S. Supreme Court. We are going to dial back here, though, as we wait for this break to play itself out. Before we get back into live testimony, we're going to listen to some of the questioning of candidate Brett Kavanaugh from Senator Orrin Hatch. He's asking yet again about this topic of Kavanaugh's attachment to the Federalist Society. Law and Crime is continuing its live coverage of confirmation hearings for U.S. Supreme Court candidate Brett Kavanaugh. Latonia Hines is an attorney, prosecutor, law professor from the Atlanta, Georgia area, and she is still with us here on Law and Crime. Latonia, this is sort of an inside look at the way judges on appeals court decide their cases.
Yes, definitely. And so for those people who are like the youngsters who are sitting in the hearing room right now that Kavanaugh has there, they're getting a chance to understand how this all works out with them. And so what Kavanaugh said that was very interesting is that he's making the point, kind of like a jury, they don't talk about the cases beforehand. They want to go in there and be able to be impartial and be able to listen to the arguments and be able to make those decisions without being influenced, or really more debating it amongst each other beforehand. We all know that, especially whenever there's an appellate issue, that there have been briefs already. Basically, someone's written, for people who don't understand the briefs, it's like someone's written an essay about why their point should be made or what point they're making. And so the justices have that beforehand, and they could have reviewed that, or their law clerks have reviewed that brief. But the oral arguments, and when people actually come in there, he's saying that they don't discuss that beforehand. And that's important because he's trying to make a point that he really tries, and he says his fellow judges try to do their best to be impartial and listen to these things with fresh ears.
Yeah, impartiality doesn't necessarily mean being uneducated. It's certainly not that. And impartiality doesn't necessarily mean being unopinionated. It means being able to set oneself aside and look at an issue as it's argued by the litigants, and to look at the issue on its merits after doing an incredible amount of studying on the issue. That's what he's articulating right there. We're going to be back here on the Law and Crime Network after this quick break with more live coverage of the confirmation hearing. Outburst in the gallery there as people listening blow up during questioning by Republican Senator Jeff Flake of Arizona. The questioning of U.S. Supreme Court pick Brett Kavanaugh. Latonia Hines with us here on the Law and Crime Network. It looks like these protests are not dialing back. This is what, the third day of this hearing? And I was thinking maybe as things filtered along here that we would see less and less of this behavior, but it seems to be moving along just about on schedule.
Yeah, it is. And it's a bit disturbing. Mostly because you have these young kids who are in the courtroom, I say courtroom, but in the hearing room right now. And Kavanaugh had his own children there, and they had to be taken out. We understand, at least we understand that this is a process and people have a right to speak, and this is a public process. But at the same time, we need some decorum and some order. It's the same thing you would have in a courtroom. A courtroom is open to the public unless there's some specific reason it's not, but you have to operate in a particular manner. And I get that the people want to express themselves, but I think being conscious of the other people in the room is very important, especially we have youngsters like that. I do find that a bit disturbing.
Yeah, look, I mean, at what point does the message get lost because it's being delivered in a way that people might find objectionable, illegal, or whatnot? We're seeing these senators and the candidate just basically not give much deference to what's being said in the same room because they probably consider it to be disrespectful.
Exactly. And to be honest, you can't really make out exactly what the people are saying anyway. And I think that it becomes distracting from whatever message they're trying to give because they just seem like they're being disruptive and they're not making their point. And once again, I go back to the fact that you have young people who are in this audience. You have young kids who are there listening and seeing this process. And I don't think that we want to encourage the behavior of being loud and being disruptive. There are ways to be able to do your civil, protests without having to do it in this manner. So I think it's a bit distracting, especially because it's been going on for 3 days. It would be one thing if it was one day, but now it keeps going on. And at some point, there needs to be some order brought back.
Yeah, it seems that way to me as well. And we heard some bipartisan agreement yesterday from both sides saying, hey, look, that they appreciate the way the Capitol Police are trying to handle this situation. We were keeping track of some of the arrests on lawandcrime.com. We have continuing coverage there of the substance of these hearings, including some of the embarrassing moments, such as misspellings on a big, huge poster. So check our website if you want to read more about what that's all about, and also to parse through some of the emails from Judge Kavanaugh Kavanaugh himself, which have been released over the last 12 or 24 hours. We are going to take a quick break here on the Law and Crime Network, but we will be back in a few minutes with more live coverage of the Brett Kavanaugh confirmation hearings. You're listening to live coverage of confirmation hearings for Judge Brett Kavanaugh, who is President Trump's pick for a seat on the U.S. Supreme Court. Latonia Hines is a law professor, prosecutor, attorney in the Atlanta, Georgia area. Latonia, I want to dial back to some of the comments from Senator Richard Blumenthal, a Democrat of Connecticut, because he really pushed an issue surrounding the Affordable Care Act to Judge Kavanaugh, showing a picture of a child who has been a beneficiary of the ACA, especially with regards to pre-existing conditions. And he said to Judge Kavanaugh, look, my understanding of your view of the law is that if President Trump considers the ACA unconstitutional, President Trump just doesn't need to allow his administration to enforce it. And I thought that that was a great former prosecutor's sense of trying to box someone into a question. If we heard that sort of questioning in a trial we were covering here at Law and Crime, we would be applauding it.
Oh, most definitely. His cross-examination of Kavanaugh was bruising, very to the point, and on times it made Kavanaugh look like he couldn't answer the question directly when he asked him very direct questions that were yes or no. And when he posed that question about the Affordable Care Act and whether or not the president goes and he should follow that or not, it reminded me about Brown versus the Board of Education. Do you remember that case with regard to the fact that there's no such thing as being separate but equal with regard to Plessy versus Ferguson? Here's a case where the Supreme Court has said that this is what needs to happen, and whether or not it's the president, whoever's in an executive office, can unilaterally decide that this is not a constitutional case and decide they're not going to follow it. It's very interesting. The way that Blumenthal went in was very text-back, very skilled. He was very skilled in his cross-examination of Kavanaugh, enough so that, because the reality is this, it's all a numbers game about who can be approved or not based off of who's in the Senate and who's going to be making the votes. But you're making a case for the public because the public is watching this. And so Blumenthal did a great job of doing that, challenging Kavanaugh, making it look like there are times when he didn't answer questions, and two, making the question of, does he have the nerve that it takes to be able to say to the president who's nominated him that you're wrong, that you can't make these decisions? Does he have the ability to go with separations of powers and respect the branch that he is meant to be there to stand up for, which is the judicial branch? So many members of this committee have law degrees. The senator we're looking at right now, Senator Crapo, a Republican of Idaho, also a Harvard law grad himself. He practiced law in his hometown. So this questioning, not necessarily out of the ballpark. This is within the skill set of many of these committee members. Most definitely. Most definitely. I was thinking maybe we'd expound on that a little bit longer, but we're approaching the end of the day here. So, Latonia Hines, appreciate you being back on Law and Crime. I know we will see you again very soon. Sounds great. Thank you. These hearings, of course, are continuing on Law and Crime. You can continue to watch them on lawandcrime.com. Last night, these hearings went very, very late. We're not quite sure how long they'll go today, but certainly you can continue to watch them, as I said, on lawandcrime.com, along with the Stanley Liggins trial that we're also covering at Law and Crime. We're going to sign off our live broadcast today for now. So this is Aaron Keller, and for all of us here at Law and Crime, have a good evening, and we'll see you tomorrow.